Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you can join the webinar this afternoon. My name is Jerry Everett, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Transportation Research here at UTK in Knoxville. Wanted to take just a few minutes here to introduce our presenters this afternoon. And first is Dr. Chris Cherry. Chris is a professor of civil and environmental engineering here at UT, and he's worked in the topic that he's going to be presenting on this afternoon in various facets over the last couple of decades, specifically with EV user behavior and the environmental impacts of EVs. And a lot of his work, in fact, most of it has been focused on micromobility. In his recent work, he's been investigating consumer uptake of emerging electric vehicle technologies, and some of his current research is funded by US DOT, TDOT, and the AAA Research Foundation. And then our second presenter who's working with Chris is Sam Barber, and he's a sophomore in civil engineering here at University of Tennessee, with his academic focus on being on sustainable transportation and automotive solutions. And Sam's research explores consumer purchasing intentions for electric vehicles in Tennessee. And I guess just in summary, I would say in observing Chris's work through the years, the thing that strikes me is not only does he do really excellent research, but that research is often very usable by practitioners. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for those kind words and that kind introduction. So the bulk of this presentation, first of all, Sam is online and Sam's the one sharing his screen, and the bulk of this presentation will be delivered by him. And I wanted to just highlight that one of the things that we're really trying to do with this study as a part of a CR2C2 MRI is understand how vehicle electrification can infiltrate rural areas in general. Rural Tennessee is where we're focused for a number of reasons here. So there's been a tremendous amount of work in this area as it relates to urban EV uptake. You can search the internet or search the Web of Science or any of the others and find a large body of work that looks at charging infrastructure, vehicle range, individual travel patterns, and so on, demographics, and find a lot of work in this area. And one of the things that we really set out to do here is try to understand what opportunities there are and barriers, of course, to adoption in rural areas. Presumably, if EVs are quite beneficial for the environment and even for individual household travel expenditures, cost of fuel, and others, rural Tennesseans or rural dwellers could benefit and should benefit from those advantages as well. Okay. So one of the things, so go ahead, Sam, next slide. So as we all know, EVs have kind of taken off over the last decade, notwithstanding kind of the last year or so where there's been a fall off in EV sales. But in 2023, there are over 1 million EVs sold, which is kind of a remarkable number and a remarkable growth rate. And a lot of that has come from the lowering cost of EVs themselves, battery technology, increasing range, and of course, incentives and other ways to induce people to buy EVs. And then maybe important for this conversation has been a real growth in the diversity of vehicle types, models that are available. And that's really important, I think, as we go down the line on this research, when we start thinking about the types of vehicles that rural dwellers may gravitate toward relative to urban markets. the EV adoption so far has been really disproportionately taken up by urban population. This is reflected in this little stat here, where rural EVs make up only about 13% of the EV fleet, while they constitute about 20% of the population. And then charging infrastructure is an important part of that, and that's something that we set out to explore. Go ahead, Sam. So the one of the important things that we looked at doing is trying to understand where electric vehicles have been adopted. We did this using some of these national level EV adoption databases that exist and found some pretty interesting findings, some pretty interesting information in the first stages of this analysis, looking at zip code level data, um, primarily zip code level data, and some smaller level of data in some cases. But what we really wanted to do is try to understand what were specific kind of almost neighborhood level factors that could explain some of the EV adoption rates in rural and urban areas, but specifically the difference between rural and urban areas. So we set out and we're able to get our hands on the Tennessee EV registration data at a very kind of fine scale, and apply that at the census block group level. Okay, so now we can take demographic data that's pretty fine-tuned, much more fine-tuned than zip codes or other larger aggregation, and assess the factors that are important to EV adoption in rural or urban areas. You can see here, these are battery-powered vehicles, and by battery-powered, Sam will help me out if I misstate this, but we have data on hybrid electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and full battery electric vehicles. And so these are the adoption rates of those vehicles. And you can see these very high clusters in terms of vehicles per 1,000 people, and a lot of density in the urban areas that pop out. If you're not familiar, the far southwest corner here is Memphis. Nashville is the blob in the middle. The blob in the middle on the southern border is Chattanooga on the right, eastern side, and then the blob directly to the center east is Knoxville. Okay, so you can see where the urban areas are, but you can also see these little pockets of small towns or rural areas or other places that may have some adoption. So go ahead, Sam, one more. Similarly, we looked at chargers, and the charging deployment is the charging sort of density is very urban centric. Of course, there's some charger density along rural corridors, but those may not be targeted toward rural dwellers, rural residents. So that's one of the things that we hope to continue to do. We got some work to do still in that area, is assess the charging density that's like rural serving charging density, we might say, that someone who lives in a rural area can assess. And all of this is trying to back into the idea that there are a lot of factors that are kind of pro EV, you might say, in rural areas. Lower fuel cost per mile could be one. More sort of community basis could be another one, where people sort of are engaged more in their rural community. They communicate more in their rural community. And we know that in urban areas, EV adoption can be driven by kind of these neighborhood effects. There's a bit more home ownership in rural areas, which actually reduces barriers related to charging infrastructure at home, or being able to charge at home, or park by a charger, essentially. So some of these things are supportive of EV adoption in rural areas, and the question is, to what extent do those factors contribute to what we see out there already? Sam, next slide, please. So I sort of got ahead of myself. These are some of the core questions that we're trying to look at. Home ownership rates, distance to charging, income, education, as it affects willingness to adopt EVs. And then we do a bit of a spatial analysis, the so-called neighborhood effect, as it affects EV uptake. Are there clusters of EVs that are popping up where there might be this social dynamic where people are buying EVs because they see more EVs or they see their neighbors have EVs? And the next part is looking at different makes and models, the vehicle type, and that's sort of a work in progress as it relates to EV adoption. So for example, our rural residents adopting, let's say, pickup trucks more, just to put it into context, or are they adopting smaller, more efficient, longer range vehicles, for example? And those are all questions that we're asking as we move forward on this. Again, this is a work in progress, and so we're presenting preliminary results today, and would love to engage with any questions as it relates to improving the research. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam and let him take you through a lot of the analysis that he did mostly, but we did, let's say, and we'll go from there. Okay, Sam, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cherry. It was pretty much summed up some very good starting points for how we started our analysis. I'll just break it down a little bit further. So pretty much how it goes in terms of current research is most of the market research, like Dr. Cherry said, focused on urban EV uptake rather than rural. But of course, this gives us a good framework to analyze EV purchasing intentions in rural US. EV purchasing intention is made up of many variables as seen on the right side of this diagram here. And we broke up these variables into vehicle, consumer, and context variables, with our target group, of course, being battery electric or BEV and plug-in hybrid or PHEV vehicles. So Dr. Cherry also mentioned the data that we had at our disposal. So we had, under the Tennessee Department of Revenue, we requested and were granted address-specific EV registrations in Tennessee, which were included information about each vehicle's drivetrain, make and model, etc. And so pictured on the right here is individual EV registrations and charging stations surrounding the Nashville metro area. This paired with American Consumer Survey demographic data put into the block group level gives a good picture of the who, what, and where of electric vehicles in Tennessee. So taking a look at just some basic summary statistics, after cleaning up the data initially that we got from the Department of Revenue, immediate summary statistic trends were recognized and tabulated to compare known trends found in urban EV research to the available Tennessee data. So for rural Tennessee, we recognized an immediate decrease in all EV drivetrain types. This is indicated by these red arrows over here. And this goes for BEVs, PHEVs, and HEVs. However, this difference was not as stark as national trends indicated, with when it was stated that rural ownership only took up 13% of the EV market, which it's a little bit greater in Tennessee. Nevertheless, computer ownership, college enrollment, income, and public charging distance, recognized as key activators for EV ownership, were lower than mean state trends, are shown here. All right, so let's take a look at this basic multivariate correlation analysis of EV ownership with various predictor variables. So on the x-axis and y-axis of this graph here, we have EV ownership indicated by the orange arrow, with age, computer ownership, college degree, income, home ownership, charging distance, mortgage satisfaction, and work travel time being other predictor variables that we decided to use in the rest of this study, as they were available demographic information as part of the American Consumer Survey. Strong correlations appear to be computer ownership, college degree, income, and home ownership, which are indicated in this correlation line right here. So with these surface level observations out of the way, approaching the methodology became a lot easier. The purpose of this methodology ultimately is to spatially model rural EV adoption using these factors to see if, one, the neighboring effect occurs, or two, if unobserved factors overwhelmingly affect EV purchasing. We started with a geocoding process, followed by a global, then local spatial cluster data analysis, finishing with a stability check and regression modeling. So let's get into the results. So first, of course, the geocoding process to convert the address values that we got from the state into usable point-based form. We use the Bing Maps Locations API to convert addresses into XY coordinates. These coordinates were anonymized and aggregated to the block group level to compare to ACS data. So to start executing the methodology, we examined spatial clustering at the block group level, searching for distinct spatial regimes in the dataset. We assumed spatial regimes presence using something known as the global Moran's I equation that is seen here on the right. A weighted matrix was also established using something known as the first order Queen's contiguity pictured at the bottom. This was preferred over a rook contiguity because of the nature of spatial diffusion through through neighborhoods and cities. So if you take a look at a certain address, we're assuming that they can be impacted by any neighboring person that also may own an EV. So the global Moran's I equation was run, where Wi of j is an element row standardized spatial weighting matrix, explained just a second ago. Y of I is the presence of EVs, and mu is the average EVs in the sample. A value of 0.549 was found, which indicates positive, strong clustering in the dataset. Moran's I equation, when close to 1, indicates perfect clustering, and -1 indicates a perfect dispersion in a dataset. So next, explanatory spatial data analysis, or ESDA, was run to discover clusters and spatial regimes in certain areas of the state of Tennessee. The local indicator of spatial association, or LISA statistic, was used, where this value of Z it refers to EVs in the mean deviation form. So let's take a look at these maps here. Figures above represent basically a visual map of the local Moran's LISA cluster map. The clusters are represented by red, where high density areas of EVs, so seen in these metro areas in the top map here, where Nashville in the center and Knoxville on the right, Memphis and Chattanooga. These high density areas are surrounded by other high density areas. This essentially creates the definition of a cluster for the LISA test. Dispersed areas are represented by low density areas surrounded by other low density areas. This is this deep blue color seen here. So shift your attention down to the bottom of the map here, where these circles indicate out of the ordinary clusters that are not seen in the rural and urban maps. So when we look only at a rural map, we're essentially increasing the sensitivity of the test to be able to find out of the ordinary areas, such as this area west of Chattanooga. A lot of these areas indicate certain affluent neighborhoods that begin a clustering throughout multiple block groups. So whether it is a few people buying a battery electric vehicle in one block group and another, and a clustering occurring, this sort of dispersion is seen in these certain areas that is not seen when looking at urban and rural areas. So if we look just at hybrid electric vehicles, of course, a similar trend is seen here in the LISA cluster map. Hybrid electric vehicles are notably more mainstream than battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles because they do not suffer from the same range anxiety that is so common in battery electric vehicles. Here, the high areas seem to be more spread out in the metro areas, so they have a little bit more bleed uh, into suburban areas. Still many low population areas in Western Tennessee. Show low density areas of EVs indicated by the blue. And whenever we increase the sensitivity to only rural areas, we are seeing some higher density areas surrounded by lower density areas indicated here by the pink. Of course, this can happen for many reasons, but one thing we began to notice with this sort of data is that there can be outside characteristics, such as if you look just northeast of Memphis, some of you all may recognize the Blue Oval City, which is essentially a Ford EV plant that's begun building many Ford batteries, and of course their new Ford F-150 Lightning that's come out has seen many sales in this area. So we're seeing many areas in which there's high density surrounded by other low density areas, which is not very common for other areas. So to verify the assumption that there's essentially two separate regimes, when saying we can separate the rural from the urban areas, an ordinary least squares test with the child test, F statistic, and Moran's I were run. Positive significant values for Moran's I and the white test were found here in this table right here. And the child test and F statistic also reject the null of coefficient stability, which essentially supports the separation of the rural and urban regimes. Now that the two spatial regimes have been identified, establishing a suitable regression model is key to see whether these factors are being influenced in a spatial manner. The spatial lag model, which is indicated by lag right here in the robust and normal Lagrange multiplier, indicates that a dependent variable, like electric vehicle adoption, is explained by a neighboring effect of other EV adopters. This essentially means that a neighborhood can bleed its influence into another neighborhood, or within the same neighborhood, an EV owner can become an EV owner because of another EV owner in that neighborhood or a close by neighborhood. While the spatial error model indicates that unobserved factors correlate electric vehicle adoption. This would really be the case if the spatial lag model fails and does not take into account certain factors that are used in this specific model. So after running the spatial lag model, it's clear that the model ran with relative strength as a moderate R-squared value and lag coefficient were present. Looking at some of the largest movers in the spatial lag regression model, we can see that some of these recognized factors that Dr. Cherry mentioned earlier, including things like age, computer ownership, which is a value that can be used to estimate technology readiness, having a college degree, and income and distance of public charging stations showed up as some of the largest impactors within this spatial lag model. Of course, all of these were positive regression values, except for the increasing charging distance, which showed up as a rather strong indicator for clustering in rural areas. So as your distance from a public charger increased, essentially the number of BEV clusters in rural areas decreased. So while on the topic of spatial dependency and spatial variation, it's important to recognize one more factor that was not accounted for in the spatial lag models, and that is EV brand. The EV brand loyalty has been around since vehicles were purchased, I guess, and there appears to be, as recognized in this specific example of Chattanooga, differences in Tesla and Ford distributions in the rural and urban landscape. So like I mentioned earlier in the blue oval city example, there can be certain instances in which there are a lot of different brands in one area and not different brands in another area. Chattanooga does not have this specific thing, basically phenomenon going on. However, you can see here, obviously, that the Teslas per 1,000 people seems to be more heavily clustered in the urban centers and suburbs of Chattanooga, while the EV Fords appears to be a little bit more spread out. And this indicates that there could be different spatial effects for different EVs, whether it's that some people simply prefer purchasing different EVs in rural areas rather than urban areas is very possible. Like Dr. Cherry mentioned, it's very common for people in rural areas to purchase lightweight trucks as part of their vehicle of choice to go to work or to bring their kid to school or something like that. So purchasing a brand like Ford may be easier for them to do rather than something like Tesla. All right, so coming over to some of the key takeaways. Obviously, like I explained in depth just a second ago, developing the spatial lag model to handle different spatial diffusion of EV purchasing factors can be used to model urban and rural EV uptake, with some limitations, of course. Not all these factors showed relative strength, so some factors suffered in rural areas and some suffered in urban areas, so they were not suitable for the model to be able to predict EV clustering. And we, of course, have identified three distinct diffusing factors in rural areas and 2 other diffusing factors in Tennessee in general to cluster in rural and urban areas, and established regional disparities in the EV brand uptake and error model for brand loyalty. So, for example, in Blue Oval City Ford. This prompts very possible future research to be validated using survey results, of course, and for more precise and larger scope methods that would not apply just to Tennessee, of course, as the Tennessee landscape is, it's pretty diverse, but there are more diverse rural areas. And finally, the last 2 is comparative EV brand modeling across urban and rural areas. So this would mean looking at different make and models to see whether these trends continue for them. So whether some people decide to purchase more SUV EVs than they do sedan EVs could be a possible trend in rural areas for families. And then finally, identification of major EV diffusion methods by the neighborhood effect. Of course, spatial models are good at locating whether diffusion exists, but this method for how the diffusion occurs is still unknown. So whether this occurs by people, talking to other people or just simply by EVs being around in neighborhoods and parked outside, any of these could be possible ways that EVs diffuse through neighborhoods and across through other neighborhoods as well. And yep, that concludes this section. So we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, this is we've got a work in progress here, and we're very keen to hear feedback from folks in the audience, and especially would love to get some good insights into different sort of hypotheses that we can continue down as we move forward with this research. I also wanted to shout out to Dr. Amin Hezave, who's a staff member at NCDOT, and he and I have worked in the past on these sort of spatial models and helped a lot with some of the data coding and support. So with that, open to questions. I see Javier has a hand up.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can.
Hey, I'm Alex Heenan. I'm here at UA. My question for you, so great presentation. Thanks for sharing that. It seems like you've observed quite a bit, looked through this data. My question is, so the next step of this, who would be the best beneficiary of this research or most likely to use it? Do you think it would be like EV manufacturers or charging providers or fleet operators? What would they take from your research and actually do to have some sort of active impact?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head on a couple of those. One of the big questions is sort of the level of charging and penetration, public charging and penetration. Do we need to build more neighborhood, or I should say rural area supportive charging, public charging? And we're not quite sure of that yet because we're not done with the research, but that's one of the core questions that we're trying to ask vis-a-vis some other sort of charging. It could be that rural people have a lot more at-home charging opportunities, so they may not be as reliant as on urban or on public charging or on multifamily housing charging and that sort of thing that we grapple with in urban areas. The second part to your question is yes. To the extent that there's kind of taste variation and preference variation in rural areas that are distinct from urban areas, I think that's an important question that the marketing departments of EV manufacturers have to figure out. But it also reflects some of the policy questions that we might address with rural uptake as well, whether it's rebates or other sorts of incentive programs at the federal or state level in a lot of places, or other sorts of, and what types of vehicles those are applied to, and what levels of incentives or rebates may exist for different types of vehicles. For example, we have different sizes of incentives based on vehicle type, right? And so those are important elements as well, sort of the educational aspect of making sure that people understand how EVs exist. And then also the so-called neighborhood effect could really help us predict better where EVs are going to be adopted first, or the next wave of EVs will continue to be adopted if there is this contagion type of effect.
Just to follow up on the first point about the rural EV chargers, it sounds like to increase rural penetration, charging was what you were talking about there. Do we put more public rural chargers, or you say it's not a problem, we don't need to do that because people can charge at home?
Yeah, so we don't know the answer to that completely yet. We do see that uptake of EVs in rural areas have this positive correlation with EV chargers, and Sam can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But if that was completely irrelevant, then we would say that the charging infrastructure doesn't seem to be the major barrier, right? But we do see a correlation there, if not a causation. We do know that EV charging at home we do know that home ownership in rural areas is much higher, and single family home ownership specifically. And that is a positive indicator toward having less reliance on public charging systems. So there's the same barriers as urban areas in some ways. People could benefit from public charging or at workplace charging or other things, but maybe not quite to the extent that the hypothesis is potentially not quite to the extent as some urban areas where, especially dense urban areas where there's not good dedicated parking for individuals at home.
Thanks so much.
We also have some chat questions as well. There is one Regan Dillard who says, is there a possibility that the Tesla clustering as opposed to the Ford EV because Tesla is more recognized as being mostly EV, especially if Ford EVs aren't easily distinguishable from their gas-powered models?
Yeah, so we don't really know why. We don't know the why part. We just know the what part, right? And so obviously Tesla has a very EV, it's a EV only brand. And so maybe when people think about buying EVs, they start with Tesla. We don't really know that part. And that's where we could get at better insights there related to interviews and surveys and so on. Teslas don't provide uh, the same exact, utility as a F-150 Lightning, for example. So all that to say is we don't really know. Yeah.
We have another one from John Carter asking, you took into account neighbors seeing other neighbors' EVs. Have you considered the effect of advertising the negative spin on EVs from the mainstream media?
Yeah, let me just reread that question just to make sure I get it right. So the one of the reasons so first of all, there's a lot of EV positive sort of efforts going on through EV organizations. So Drive Electric Tennessee or some of these others are trying to counter many of these questions. Another thing that we keep looking at, kind of to the same point, is where EV could be serviced anywhere near a rural area. And so if you look at kind of the service centers or the dealerships that sell EVs in Tennessee, for example, they're very urban oriented. And excuse me, part of the story is making sure that dealerships are well trained to provide the right vehicle for someone who is interested in an EV and to help sell the EVs essentially. So that's a kind of ongoing issue as it relates to dealerships and point of sale information and marketing essentially. We didn't really dive into the media part. We were just looking at adoption. So we just don't know what drives somebody from a consumer preference perspective, whether they were marketed and so on. The neighborhood effect, though, is something where throughout all the social diffusion models and other things, you see an effect of new technology trickling in clusters generally, especially a highly visible thing like a neighbor's car or cars on the street around you. But to the point of the previous comment, EVs are getting less and less conspicuous, you might say. They look more and more like conventional cars in many ways. And so it's possible that that neighborhood effect may be diminished by that factor. We don't know that though.
We have another question in the chat that says daily typical uses, I think, would play a large role in EV uptake, as many in rural areas are using their vehicles for work trucks over long distances, i.e., unable to recharge easily while out in the field all day. I'm not sure if this was meant to be a question or a general statement, but
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. That's something we're trying to do with the ACS data is that data set has average trips, distances and basic travel behavior for work-related trips. Obviously, there are people that live in rural areas and urban areas for that matter that use work trucks all day and travel dozens or hundreds of miles in those vehicles each day. And in those cases, well, in many of those cases now EVs could start to meet those needs because of the longer range battery ranges. again, this is where we need to, if we wanted to get into that question specifically, we would need to get into the tails of the distribution of travel behavior and which types of users, which users with which travel profile are actually picking up EVs versus those who aren't.
It seems like I missed a question from earlier from Matthew Palm asking, could the neighborhood effect also have something to do with broader national patterns in residential self-selection, not selecting on EV charging, but in terms of general lifestyle and politics?
Yeah, so of course we'd be remiss to ignore the fact that EVs can be a politically charged and swing in either side of the aisle, so to speak, as it relates to motivation for adopting EVs, right? And so just like politics are clustered or lifestyles are clustered, self-selection, then that's actually a very fair point. So we don't have a case control here. We're not able to say why they're clustered necessarily, except that they are clustered in many ways. One of the maps that Sam showed shows a little cluster in South Tennessee, and that's the University of the South. So it's a very kind of affluent small town in the middle of rural Tennessee that has a lot of professors and students and others that are probably of a certain persuasion, that are probably different than your typical, let's say, rural dweller. Okay, and so that cluster may have more to do with that demographic, still controlling for demographics that we have, than what we would see in a kind of a random distribution. So that's a fair point.
And last question from the chat is from Alex Hayden. Was computer ownership percentage negatively correlated with EV ownership? Would you please clarify or comment on this?
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, I can speak on that just for a second. Yeah. It's so yeah, I think he's referencing the spatial lag model. So for urban and rural areas, the p-value basically showed that it was not significant at that value. And though for Tennessee in general, it did show a very slight negative trend, which would mean that as computer ownership increases in block groups, that spatially that EVs tend to cluster less. It's a very small value, especially compared to something like college degree, but it is obviously a limitation of the looking at simple block group data like that, is that trends like this can pop up if they're very small. I don't know if Dr. Cherry, you have anything to add, but
Yeah, I think that's one fair point. We think of others have used computer ownership as an indicator of sort of tech savviness or whatever, but at some extent, computers are ubiquitous in many ways now, almost ubiquitous. So we lose some of that explanation. It's significant and it's negative, so I don't know. I'm not sure what that's picking up. It's kind of a strange finding. I see a couple others coming in.
Yeah, we have another one asking of any insights in the uptake of EVs used for commercial purposes by companies.
Yeah, we don't have any of that information here. It is a important question, especially if it becomes a bottom line business expenditure, then a company would take a more deliberate approach to picking an EV based on its performance, right? And its cost, overall lifetime cost. And so we don't know any of that though. That's not in maybe we may be able to dig into some of the registration data and see if we can categorize that. That's a good idea. So maybe we'll look at that. It's in some ways it's hard to see if a car is registered as a commercial vehicle, or well, if it's registered by a commercial entity or not, but that may be something worth looking at. Thanks, Assad. Yeah.
Kofi asked, do you know the correlation between the college degree and computer ownership? Could those two variables be correlated?
Yeah, we should have that in our correlation matrix. I'll pull it up on my slides here. Have that. Where's that? I'm sure there's some correlation. College degree, computer ownership is highly correlated. It's correlated positively. It's not what 0.25, 0.3, something like that. So yeah, there's correlation. It's not the strongest correlation, but there is a positive correlation in there, according to the matrix that I'm looking at on one of the slides. Yeah. Hopefully, a lot of times the models should try to capture the main effect of that in the regression. So hopefully that's captured. The main effect is captured.
We have a question from Deborah of the possibility of EV. I think this is just a statement, but it's the possibility of EV resistance associated with relatability unknowns, environmental considerations associated with mining rare minerals, power plant demands, battery life unknowns, battery replacement costs, battery disposal of toxic material considerations. There's also a purchase cost comparisons between fuel operated and battery powered vehicles. I didn't know if you wanted to make a comment on that as well.
Yeah, we can't see insights into the motivation for why people are or how people are considering all these factors, particularly in rural or urban areas for that matter, without asking them directly. We do know that like essentially lower just financing and lower higher purchase cost would be harder to finance for somebody with lower income, for example. And we know that rural folks on average have lower income. So we do know that that purchase cost comparison versus operating cost savings over time is often a barrier for lower income people that have what we'd say is a higher discount rate for future fuel savings. They can't really capture all that fuel savings and put it into higher purchase cost essentially. So we see this across many transportation decision making is the willingness to pay for some future fuel cost savings is often heavily discounted, you might say, by the driver or by the purchaser, and I think that could be true here also.
And then we have a question from Celine. Have you considered the climate of a certain neighborhood to affect EV ownership, as EV battery performance have been reported to degrade with decreasing temperatures?
Yeah, we didn't look at that. We are only looking at Tennessee, which has a pretty moderate climate throughout, of course, as I think most folks know. We haven't looked at places in the mountains, for example, that are probably generally cooler, or West Tennessee, which probably has average higher temperatures than the Northeast Tennessee, for example. So we didn't look at that. I don't think there's a huge variation. If we looked at a national study and we started with that, there may be something to be had to be discussed there. But we didn't look at that. Yeah. Good point though.
And then Javier asked, are you testing results with different neighboring matrix?
Testing results with different neighboring matrix. You mean the no, I don't think so. Sam, we're not using a different sort of neighbor. I assume you're talking about the rook contiguity or queen contiguity or some of these other approaches to defining a neighbor. And if so, then I'm not sure. Sam, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, at least from what I can understand of this, it seems like from the nature of how queen and rook contiguity work, queen makes most sense in most areas for Tennessee. That's if we're considering that, each neighbor has the capacity to be impacted, basically from all sides of itself. I did run similar tests using rook contiguity, and they're very similar results. But yeah, that is a good point. I guess there are different matrices to look at for these sort of things, but I think Queen made most sense, at least for Tennessee.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself as well.
One question. Thank you so much, both the speakers, Chris and Sam. One question, did you find any difference between the patterns of EVs and hybrid ones? And if you see that sort of pattern, that hybrid might kind of serve as addressing some of the concerns that might have, such as range anxiety and those sort of things that might be presenting in rural communities a little bit more. Did you observe any sort of results from this survey, this data analysis?
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah. Yeah, so just some general trends that we looked at before really diving into the statistical analysis was that we noticed that clustering occurred on a wider scale for hybrid electric vehicles. Whenever you look at a metro area like Nashville, for example, the EVs or battery electric vehicles stick pretty close to, affluent neighborhoods and places that can get into the inner city pretty close for where their work is. But the hybrid electric vehicles, we saw that registrations were a lot more, much wider on the map. I think you're right in that when it comes to commuting, hybrids are seen as the more positive option here. And like I mentioned at the end as well, when it came to like brands, for example, we'll want to look into how clustering occurs, especially when it comes to hybrids as well. So look into running different tests to see how these factors affect hybrids as well. So that is a very good point as well.
Yeah, I think that's so for our sake, we have a data set that includes hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and battery electric hybrids. And obviously hybrids are very mainstream now, essentially. And we're treating those in some ways like a mainstream vehicle and looking at EVs and plug-in hybrids as sort of a distinct version of those. So I think that's kind of our main approach. We would love to have had like conventional vehicle registrations too. We don't have those, unfortunately. So we can back some of that information out just looking at car ownership rates at block groups from the ACS. But yeah, so.
So looks like that. Is there any other question, Krishna? In the chat box?
Not from the chat box.
Okay. So I think it's already 12:54. So thank you so much, both the speakers for great talk and insight that you provided today, but also great questions. Enjoyed the conversation after the talk as well. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.